I'd like to introduce Carrie Feder, the curator of Hermerica. As a partner in Athens Architectural Workshop, Carrie worked in architectural design and historic preservation. She is a trustee of the historic Eastfield Foundation and the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. Carrie has curated, co-curated, and installed several art exhibitions at the Athens Cultural Center, which juxtapose contemporary art with historical artifacts. Previously, she worked at the Whitney Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Carrie has a BA in art and art history from Brown University, studied printmaking in the graduate program at the San Francisco Art Institute, and exhibited her work in New York City for many years. Carrie will guide us on a tour of the Hermerica exhibition, which is on view through Sunday, April 25th. There will be time for questions at the end, so please type your questions into the chat window. And so I would like to welcome Carrie to start. And first, I just want to ask you, how did you come up with the idea for the exhibition? And how did it come about?
Well, back in 2017, I was asked to do an exhibition at the Athens Cultural Center to celebrate the centennial of women's right to vote in New York State, and which I did that show. And Portia Munson, an artist that has been associated with Byrdcliffe and is in this show, asked me sometime later about working with her on a exhibition for the centennial in the United States, which was last year, 2020. Well, because of COVID, of course, we postponed the exhibit, but that was the initial invitation to do the show. And I want to say right now, thank you to Portia for, involving me and being an incredible help and consultant on this exhibit. I guess I'll tell you how I started to think about the show. Of course, many people were doing shows for the various centennials, and I didn't feel like I wanted to attempt to retell the long and often complex history of the suffrage movement, which of course has many political ins and outs and is quite complicated and spans from the early 19th century into the 20th. What I wanted to do was sort of tell the tale from another point of view, a call and a response, a conversation between the old and the new, starting with the examination of the beginnings in the 1830s and 40s. And in particular for the New York State centennial, New York State was really, the volcano erupting in the suffrage movement. The 30s and 40s also have so many similarities with our own times, with the turbulent different movements and ideas that were going on. But mostly, I wanted to reflect upon how women and why women started to really find their voice. And that's the kind of essential theme of the show.
Great. So I'm going to share some images and we're going to see some images from the exhibition. How does that look? Can you see? Oh, it's loading. Can you see it?
Yep, there
Great.
we go. So there's such wonderful images from the suffrage period, but I wanted to really do more early 19th century images. And the show is basically a very subjective visual contemplation of the issues and imagery that I would call our collective past. And this, as the subject is so large, I just wanted to pick on a few themes that had interesting visual components and issues that contemporary women artists would be interested in. Karlyn, next.
Sorry, hold on.
Okay.
I'd rather have me on there. Can you get rid of my picture?
The inspiration for the visual look of the show is based on some of the venues that protests and expositions and gatherings were in the 19th century. These are two pictures of the interior of the Women's Building at the Columbia Exposition at the Chicago World Fair in 1893, which you can see there's like a concentration of hangings and banners and flags and artwork. Next.
Sorry.
Yeah. And this is an engraving of the Democratic National Convention in 1880 in Cincinnati. So they're densely packed. I mean, part of it is also, as you'll see, is the structure of the gallery itself at the Kleiner James in Woodstock, which has high ceilings and rafters. But I wanted it to be I wanted there to be a visual impact that harked back to these gatherings and create an atmosphere that tells a story. The picture on the right is a colorized photograph of suffragists marching with the banner and of colors that became associated with the movement, and which I painted some of the walls in the gallery purple. And of course they had symbolism: purple for loyalty, purpose, and steadfastness to the cause; white for purity, gold for light and light, the torch that guides our purpose. Next. So here's the show. And as you can see, it's a, a gathering of images and structures and pieces, art pieces, so that there's a celebratory feeling that harks back to those images I just show you. Of course, even though the journey as it's told has the dark sides of American history as well. Next. So of course, the essential question is, how much have things changed and how much have they stayed the same? And though this is stated in quite an unladylike fashion, here is the question: same blank, different century. And this was at a protest march in Albany soon after the election in 2016. Next. I think you skipped it. There we go. So looking back at the 1830s and 40s is an important starting point. It was a time when gender roles were very strictly prescribed, and women not only lacked the right to vote, but the right to such things as even their own property. I mean, they had very little control over their lives in terms of legalities, for instance. But they were considered to be the moral centers of society. And as such, it seemed natural that they would become involved in many of the issues that were going on in the day. Abolitionism, religious revival, temperance, dress and educational reforms were movements that kind of related to their moral position in the family and in society and allowed them to speak, whereas other professions or associations would not. And they became at the forefront of these movements, and were able to actually take leadership roles, which prepared them for the continuing fight. A continuing theme for me is the question in doing a show like this is how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. And time again, when I'm researching for a show like this, history's redundancies haunt me. This is a picture, rather stern ladies, the Grimsky sisters, but they were very serious and fervent abolitionists and women's rights advocates. But when you read some of the words that have been said, they just resonate because it's happening around us today. And here's a quote from Sarah Grimke in 1837. "But I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God designed us to occupy." Well, I don't think I need to explain why that phrase sounds familiar. in the news today. Next. All right, this picture is destruction of the fire of Pennsylvania Hall, another image that just resonates today. And I actually was like looking into this very close to January 6th when the Capitol was seized in Washington. So it's a haunting image for me because the place was burned to the ground on the first day that it was open. It was a building built for abolitionist meetings and lectures. And the first night where a woman or several women got up to speak in what was called, it's actually a great phrase, a mixed audience, a promiscuous audience, because it was mixed men and women, whites and blacks. And this was reported to the public and the anti-slavery agenda. And also a white woman was seen walking out of the hall with a black arm in arm with a black woman. And so a exterior crowd torched the building and the firemen just watched and did nothing and let it burn to the ground. So it had a one night life. Next. So the way I set up the show, and I'm going to do this talk, and I want to mention every artist in the show. It's sort of like a narrative that goes left. You can read it from left to right around the gallery. And I made groupings of imagery historical imagery juxtaposed with contemporary art. And here you're seeing a corner that's sort of the beginning of the show, which I will get into next. But in the foreground, I just want to point out Cynthia Karasek's Hung Out to Dry, which I sort of placed in the area around the beginnings of the story, which is about slavery and temperance and educational reform. And this is obviously quite a brutal piece by Cynthia that packs quite a punch, I think. It's made of wood, just by the way, everybody asked that question, with a rust-colored covering. Next. The first painting in the area where I'm showing ephemera from the early anti-slavery movement is a painting by Deborah Priestley called Strange Fruit 2. And she writes, "The canning jar is the locus through which narratives unfold." This is such an interesting painting where within the canning jars are imageries from the transatlantic slave trade. And there are images of the interiors of the slave ships or the shackles, or like up on the right, an image of an enslaved man who has been whipped, or there's a picture of Sojourner Truth, but it powerfully deals with issues of memory, ancestry, and history as Deborah describes it. Next. This is a reproduction of a engraving that was in one of the many anti-slavery papers, or called an almanac. And these sorts of engravings that were, circulated at the time were very powerful communicators, as you can see from this picture, selling a mother from her child, and it's heartbreaking. This, of course, was very effective to motivate the women to become involved. And Lucy Stone, who was an abolitionist in the early to mid 1800s, wrote, "If while I hear the wild shriek of the slave mother robbed of her little ones, if I do not open my mouth, am I not guilty?" So all of this was tied up with, dealing with a horrendous situation in our nation, and then responding to it and taking action, which women did. And really is credited to be how they were able to fight the fight for women's right to vote. Next. So I happened to be at Melora's house for a yard sale, and I saw this dress in the studio, Melora Kuhn, the artist Melora Kuhn. And she described to me that she had created this dress out of an old blue and white coverlet, a jacquard coverlet, which would have been made around the 1840s. And she created a outfit for herself to wear to a Black Lives Matter protest march. And her association was that it's a tattered coverlet, and it's made mostly of cotton, and the association is that of the blood that was on the cotton market made through slavery. And I just thought it was a great piece for the show. And we also discussed the very interesting free produce movement that originated in Britain in the 1820s and came here mostly and was mostly pushed forward by the Quakers, who were involved in all of these movements, really. But the free produce movement was, meant to boycott everything made by the slave trade, which was no easy feat. I mean, it's just like today, if you're going to try to boycott certain things that are made and make things cheaper for you, it's a difficulty. So of course, things that were as essential as cotton, indigo, sugar, coffee, rice, tea, or tobacco, these were all coming out of the slave environment. And so it wasn't that successful as a movement, but it was nevertheless something where there were warehouses that sold only free labor markets. And one little interesting tidbit is the Lucretia Mott, who was a member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, gave out sweets to friends and acquaintances that were sort of like little, fortune cookies. Take this, my friend, you need not fear to eat. No slave hath toiled to cultivate this sweet, was what the little cookie or sweet made from perhaps maple syrup was wrapped in. Maple syrup, by the way, was the one like American non-slave produced item that actually increased because of this boycott. Next, please. And this section in the corner on the left are images from 19th century temperance manuals and pictures of the religious revival that was called the Second Great Awakening. The temperance movement was fueled by a feeling that this was a terrible sin to drink and caused abuse and financial downfall. The Second Great Awakening was like a evangelistic fire that spread throughout the country with camp meetings and things like that. There was a fear that America was facing a spiritual crisis and it needed to be saved. And all these things were going on at once. So it really was turbulent times. It was a time of an age of self-improvement and of reckoning, really. Next slide, I think I have more close-ups. So on the left are some pictures of a camp meeting where people would go out in tents and sort of have religious, revival and speak in tongues or have spiritual awakenings together. The New York Oregon was a temperance magazine with illustrations. This is an illustration of a man drunk and trying to encourage his whole family to drink with him. And the little plate is, many of these things were, propagandized by being put on objects of use, utilitarian objects like this, a child's plate. What better way to teach your children about the evils of drink than to have them eat their breakfast off of a little plate that shows a temperance meeting? But in juxtaposition with this is the very interesting work of Katrina McHugh, who takes what you would consider the women's work, art of needlepoint or cross stitch, and then kind of puts very political images that she has sewn or cross-stitched. This is a sexual assault evidence collection kit cover. So, you know, if you've been raped or sexually assaulted, this would be the cover of the evidence pages, and when you would go into a police station. And this is one of the reason it is put with the temperance movement, is because there was so much sexual abuse and within families, and that was one of the reasons the women fought so hard for temperance. People who understand about the history of this country and how much drinking there was, and part of it, of course, was because water was not that safe to drink. So there became a lot of imbibing of other liquids. And apparently by the 1820, it was considered to be gotten out of hand. Next slide. This is, I have a section here on the very important influence of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. The book was a runaway bestseller and remained so for a very long time. And the story is that Harriet Beecher Stowe lost a child or had some tragedy in her family, and then felt that she could empathize with the suffering of enslaved families. And she felt more closer to this subject and felt more empathy, and then wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, even though there's plenty of pretty horrible stereotypes in the book that could be criticized, still influenced people to be, you know, against slavery. And when she was introduced to Lincoln, it's said that he said to her, "So this is the little lady who made the big war," referring to the Civil War, of course. Now, Kiki Smith's print, I'm certain she didn't make this print in reference to Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it's an example of how I paired things together, because it's such an empathetic portrait of a person. There's sadness in it, and there's a big tear, and I felt that it very much illustrated what I was getting at with this group of images. Next, please. This is one of a piece by, two pieces in the show by Daesha Devón Harris, Break Me My Bounds and Let Me Fly, from a series that she calls Just Beyond the River, a folktale series. And it's a photograph under glass. Break Me My Bounds is etched in glass on the frame, and so it reflects into this image. And the images take reference often to water crossings, which of course was one of the stories of escaping slavery. And I'll just read something she wrote. Just Beyond the River weaves together historical imagery, found objects, and natural elements in the landscape, and is inspired by Negro folklore, slave narratives in Harlem Renaissance literature, particularly stories that involve crossing of water. This work highlights America's enduring legacies of colonialism and systemic racism, while reiterating the central narrative that emerges from the reference memoirs, the ongoing struggle for freedom. Next, please. So then I'm moving forward to, and I hope, you know, so obviously these are the beginnings of women getting out there and speaking up, and speaking in public, and speaking beyond the prescribed world that they were supposed to stick to. But this section is more about women's work, the traditional crafts, sewing, quilting, cleaning, cooking, life cycle that is so much a part of women's lives in the 19th century and before and now. And it's very interestingly enough reflected often in contemporary women artists' work, use of materials or references to these sorts of tasks that are part of our heritage. In the center is Ruby Palmer's Quilter Lament, which at first glance, is looks like a very abstracted piece. This is what she wrote about it. I thought of it as a quilt that had been cut up, chunks removed, messing with my perception of our democracy as a whole patchwork of history, and turned it into merely a remnant, an armature of lattice of what is left when these major pieces were challenged and removed. And there are little patches of pinks in this. And again, and as several pieces in this show, it's very interesting. We're very much influenced by the Trump era and the election and the fear that came with it, of perhaps losing ground that we had achieved in the women's movement. Next, please. It's a little collection of pieces of quilts. The circular quilt piece on the right is a signature quilt piece, which was often part of charity fundraising with women, and particularly as we went out west. It's actually a doll's quilt, but it shows a typical pattern, and a sampler below, which obviously was teaching young girls how to sew and embroider was an enormous part of their education. But on top are two paintings by Jeanette Fintz. One is called Tumble 5, and the other one is called Original Role Play. And Jeanette works with a lot of abstraction and geometry, and which some of it refers to quilts and patterns in fabrics, or tiles or decorative arts, or just pure geometry. But they relate here so closely because all of these things that women were working on, besides their utilitarian use, it's redundant, had patterns. They utilized, women were seeing and working with patterns of all sorts throughout time. So I paired Jeanette's Tumble with below a antique from the late Victorian era, tumbling block pattern. And as you can see, the similarities. Below that is it's hard to see in this picture, but it's a homespun, meaning spun at home, sheet made by Desiree Martin, 1837, proudly embroidered with her name. And surely she made it, and surely she used it for herself. Next. A lot of there's something that was discussed and theorized about and believed in the 19th century called, the women's sphere, the world that a woman was in charge of or belonged in. And this was the home, and this was the morality, the caretaker of morality, the true woman, religiously pious, morally pure, physically delicate, highly emotional and intuitive, submissive to her husband, and above all else, devoted to the domestic pursuits of housekeeping and child rearing. The picture on the left is a Currier and Ives print that shows, you're going up the stairs of life and you're going down the stairs of life. It's called The Life and Age of Woman, Stages of a Woman's Life from the Cradle to the Grave, and from 1850. And in the exhibit, I also have the partner to it, which is The Life and Age of Man. And it's very interesting to see what is the life of a woman versus the life of man. And of course, it's much different to see what was expected in a lifespan of a woman is versus a man. To the right is one of my favorite things that I owned, actually. And of course I got it on eBay, where else? But it's somebody had bought at not a yard sale, an estate sale, these incredibly personal pieces of a family's life. In one little box was all these snippets of fabric, each one pinned and written in like 19th century hand, identifying what piece of fabric it was what piece of clothing it was and when it was worn, or what curtain it was from. So there's a wedding dress, there's a waistcoat, all with who owned it, the history, not only of the textiles, but of this family, of the life of this family, a chronicle of their history. And in the other box that I purchased from the same estate sale was a box that had sort of like all the emblems of womanhood of this time period, a box with papered from Ladies' Goldie books with calling cards, of course, the prayer book, the fan, the thimble, and some small letters. In the exhibit above this is a page from a journal from a Hudson Valley family that really does tell the story of life told in minutes. You know, it's a recording of the births and deaths, and rather than someone being born and living 40 years, it could be weeks or days. And then there's the recounting of the babies being born and being named the same name over and over again as each one dies, in the hopes that the next one named with his name will actually survive and have the name survive. So I think there was it's a classic understanding of a time period when birth and death was much more a part of your expected experience on a daily basis. Next, please. Then there's a whole section on fashion and how women presented themselves and how society made them present themselves. And of course, that could not be without a section with corsets and undergarments. Dress reform and what was called the rational dress movement in the mid-19th century was a really big movement, because of course women were incredibly restricted by what they had to wear, which was fashion, but it was also affected what they were able to do. Tanya Marcuse got a Guggenheim in, I guess, 2002 or around then, and went to museums in America and Britain and photographed undergarments and armor that were in various collections, made these beautiful recordings of these artifacts from another time, which look entirely sculptural. But the combination, we just chose like 12 images out of this series and mixed them up between the women's undergarments and armor to create that push and pull between what they actually are, between dress, fashion, restriction, and protection. Next, please. There's the installation of the 12 pieces that are above Ladies' Godie's books, which were sort of like the Martha Stewart magazine of the day, telling women everything they needed to know to do everything they needed to do in the home. The trouble with the fashion was, besides the restriction, is there actually were, health problems associated with these incredibly cumbersome and restrictive outfits. So the top picture is of an advertisement for a lecture on lungs, where women's chests were actually compressed so that it was hard for them to breathe. The little framed quote below describes a woman fluttering and breathing like a dying bird because she couldn't breathe. And the pincushion below is lungs, Dirty Little Lies pincushion by the artist Claudia McNulty, and which was actually a response to what happened after 9/11 and the pollution and the ability to breathe or not if you were in downtown Manhattan. The image on the right is a reproduction of I think an old glass negative photograph of someone wearing a bloomer outfit. So everybody's who heard of bloomers, And bloomerism became a big thing because this was a new freeing form of dress with pantaloons or bloomers and a sort of Middle Eastern inspired outfit, which gave a woman, well, it doesn't look like it from this picture, but this was freedom. This was what they considered to be freedom. And the reason it was called bloomer or bloomerism was not because she invented the fashion, but because she, Lily Bloomer, was a publisher of The Lily, and which was a woman's magazine. Next, please. Here is sculpture by the artist Rose DeLear, whose mother was a seamstress in the garment district of New York, and she grew up watching her work, and then obviously was influenced enough to incorporate this into her sculpture. And these are made to look like they're made out of your typical pattern, like a McCall's pattern, but the writing on the edges are really political statistics about things such like as women's pay raise, their pay in comparison to men, or their body image and things like that. So it adds a different, entirely different dimension to them. Next, please. This piece is by Kathy Ruttenberg, and it has, her work is a fantastical quality, as if there's a man and a deer with a deer's head who's fixing her hair, and it's partially about that vision of a woman taking care of herself, or a man expecting her to look a certain way, but there is a dark side to it, as in many ways, the whole story has a dark side. The familiar routine of feminine beauty and hairstylings contrasted against the internal story happening with her gut, where all internal darkness ruminates. So there is a scene inside the skirt, which I all encourage you to come and see, and you can have your own opinion of it. Next, please. Trisha Wright has done a series of paintings called The Walled Garden. This one is Walled Garden, a man looking at a woman looking at herself. And within the bell jar, which has many connotations itself, is a image from a Courbet painting of a woman looking at herself on it, and it's on an iPad. So it's mashing together all different centuries and iconography. I'll just read what she says. This series considers ways in which women tend to be perceived in parts, not as whole. Historically, the walled garden in art denotes a space set apart, specifically a feminine space. My work has long been concerned with perception and the act of looking and being looked at, an enduring reality for women. I think that says a lot about truly the reality for women and some of the themes that are in the show. Next, please. Portia Munson created this piece, and I'll show you the whole piece in a second, for the show that I did for the Centennial, as it makes reference to the tea table that the women who got together in Seneca Falls and wrote the Declaration of Sentiments got together around a tea table. And so this refers to that, and the symbolism of the white in the suffrage movement, and in general. I collect and display objects in the form of women or a woman's body part as part of an investigation into who we are as represented in these objects. Portia also draped all the openings in the gallery with garlands of women's long white gloves. Next, please. There to the left is the tiered tea table or wedding cake of kitsch objects referring to women. Kate's piece, Words Untie Knots, Pussy Bow Blouse Redux. Kate reconfigured this piece for the show. As you can see, it's a gigantic blouse. And wanted to, in discussions about what to do for the show, she came up with taking the bow or the tie and putting words on it. And if it hadn't been COVID, the tie goes through the typewriter and visitors would have been allowed to add their own words. Kate put quotes and writings from women through the last century, and then also her own ruminations all on the bow there. So, and then wrote this about it. When a woman wears a pussy bow blouse, she ends up with an elaborate bow knotted around her voice box. I've been reading many women whose words enabled change. Thinking about what they wrote, I began to type my own words into fabric. By relating to the women thinkers I was reading, I found new courage. My advice, unite, unmute, words really are important. Next, please. To me, this is one of the funniest and most poignant pieces in the show. By Catherine Umstead, tiaras, little princess tiaras on pink pieces of felt. I make the tiaras, lay them down in the middle of Broadway in front of my apartment, and the trucks flatten them. It's funny, but it's sad. and it speaks to sort of aspirations and expectations for young women, very succinctly manifested in this piece. Next, please. Valerie Hammond did this silk banner of a harpy. And in this section, as you look towards the right, are several pieces that have bird associations. And like a lot of the subject in this show, I mean, there could be a whole show just on women and birds, or women as birds, or women being attacked by birds, or women being stereotyped as birds. But the harpy also has, many connotations as well. Hammond found herself adding girls' heads to the body of birds to convert the motif into an expression of strength and transformation. The harpies are a gang of girls invested with the power to punish wrongdoing. Again, sort of in response to the 2016 election. Next, please. Beth Katleman does porcelain work that is very intricate and elegant, based on Wedgwood decorative arts and architectural detailings, but yet have hidden sort of sinister commentary within them. And this one is called Hostile Nature, Detail the Birds. And if you look closely, you can see that there's a girl with a tennis racket beating off a flock of birds and being confronted by a little chirping bird. Tippi Hedren, beware. Next, please. Susan Whitey's, who's a photographer, many years ago, traveled around the United States and photographed wax museums, images in wax museums, which have a very eerie quality to them. And this is of a little girl who was, I think there might have been a specific story. I don't know what it was, but for the context of the show, it related to the birds and to the speaking through something other than oneself, as well as being muffled, because the bird is right in front of her mouth. So she's either talking to the bird or through the bird, or is being stifled by the bird. But as well as the bird imagery, it's a powerful image to me of a young girl, kind of frozen in the wax depiction of her. Next, please. Yura Adams' Letter to the World. Yura made this banner for the show and is took abstracted imagery of a rose, and on the side, it relates to the quilting and sewing of the other segment of the exhibit. And those are little vertical lines that are quilt pieces. On the one side, it's a translucent piece, and on the one side is this abstracted imagery, and on the other side are words and thoughts. Letter to the World celebrates brave women who speak loudly and clearly, leading their lives heedless of the bias of men to discount them. Next, please. It's a overall shot. Next, please. You might wonder why I've broken dishes in the show, but these are some of my favorite objects that I collect myself. They're called make-dos or lead, stapled repaired porcelain. And before the days of crazy glue, here you have lead staples that were used to hold together these precious objects. And to me, it relates in many ways. One, the disposability of our culture as versus the 19th century, when you just didn't throw everything away if they had any damage. And as one person said to me who was visiting the exhibition, that they represented to her, and I had this thought as well, of the fragility, the brokenness, that women have had to go through and yet still stay together and move on. And plates that have lasted, these patched together plates have survived 200 years and are still a thing of beauty. Next. And speaking of things of beauty, this is Corinne Spencer's Body of Plenty, Harvest, Spoil, Sprout, and Root, which are powerful imagery in so many ways. A work that explores the Black feminine body as a site of opulent abundance, which holds within it both beauty and distortion. Next, please. These pieces are by Valerie Hammond, who did the Harpy. And she has been doing these paintings of women's faces, and she calls them Bedlam, Breath, Bedlam 7, 4, and 13. And I put them together in this way. This wasn't necessarily how Valerie imagined them, but they really express the theme of finding one's voice, of being muffled, and then finding a way to release the words and express yourself, that women did throughout the century and in the last few centuries in the movement. Next, please. This is a close-up where you can see that a moth or butterfly is covering this woman's mouth, and in the other picture a flower is covering her mouth, and in the other two that were in the previous, then a puff of smoke is coming out and butterflies are coming out. But Valerie's comment is silence equals death. Next, please. This is another piece by Ruby Palmer, who does some architectural mock-ups, and I was very attracted to this piece to put it in conversation with a very famous book from the late 19th century, or actually a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, published in 1892, which immediately became sort of a feminist track. It referred to a woman who, her husband, who was a doctor, diagnosed her as having temporary feverish depression and a slight hysterical tendency, basically a catch-all phrase for everything women had felt in the late 19th century. This was the diagnosis. But he put her in a room to recuperate, and she begins to imagine that there's a woman trapped in the wallpaper, in the yellow wallpaper, and then in fact becomes trapped in it herself or wants to go in. It's up to your interpretation. Next, please. Liza Todd Tivy drew this beautiful rendition of a horse and rider, Inez, she made this for the show. And Inez Mulholland was one of the most famous suffragettes. She was considered the most beautiful suffragette. That's a picture of her on the right. But the reason that this image that Liza made is based on Inez heralded the March on Washington in 1913 and headed it on a horse called Gray Dawn, wearing this crown and a white robe. And she was quite an incredible woman. She was a activist and a labor lawyer, a socialist, a pacifist, and a war correspondent. But she suffered from what they called pernicious anemia. And as she was campaigning and lecturing all around the country for one of the national women's organizations, she succumbed to the anemia and actually died as a very young woman, and so became sort of a martyr. Next, please. Which, by the way, actually, I don't know if I've said this already, but suffragette is a derogatory term, or originated as a derogatory belittlement of women, because it was like an a little woman, a rockette, rather than a suffrage person. And but it stuck, a suffrage. See, it's hard to pronounce. Maybe that's why they changed the word. But this is a collection of images from the movement, including a lot of these so-called humorous postcards that you see towards the bottom. Some of those are temperance postcards from the 20th century versus the earlier 19th century, but the ones that are all on the second level from the bottom are like the typical making fun of the movement by showing the husbands taking care of the children and having to cook and clean because their wives have gone off and abandoned them and made them do the housework while they fought for the vote. Another story that is beginning to be told more than it has been in the past is the great contribution and efforts of African-American women in the suffrage movement. And this is a picture of some women from the National Association of Colored Women, when around 1896, they coined the phrase, inspirational phrase, "lifting we climb." Next. This is, you saw this piece on the left by Susan Mastrangelo, and probably some of the overall shots of the show. And to me, they were an important component of the exhibition because of the movement and the gathering and the excitement, to me, of the group of women moving forward. Susan writes, a stage set of female components frozen, caught in the moment as they reenact life realized through the silent language of gesture. The integration of color and pattern came together as content as women evolve and make themselves evident. To the right is a portrait, a self-portrait from a while ago that Yura Adams painted, which I just felt was appropriate to the show as a very strong, direct gaze of a woman artist portrayed in this painting. Next, please. And here we're coming towards the end. Here's a grouping of things that are more 21st century references, like the Guerrilla Girls that were political activists within the art world, a pussy hat with a resist button. And actually there's also, in tipping my hat to the nurses and medical women that have helped us through this past year, there's a paper doll from World War II of nurses. Next, please. This is Toxie by Claudia McNulty, which is a Barbie doll made of lead. And that basically says it all, the toxicity of the imagery. As a preteen, I played with the first Barbie and Ken dolls, never considering the influence it was undoubtedly wreaking upon my psyche and self-image as a young child woman to be. And I think probably any female that is listening to this has some experience in terms of Barbie and the image of this tiny waist and tall legs, et cetera, et cetera. Next, please. On the left is a collection of buttons collected by my friend Nora Edelman, who has gone to many marches, many of them Planned Parenthood and Equal Right Amendment protest marches, and has collected these buttons that tell quite a story. Next to it is another cross stitch by Katrina McCute, where she has a series called In Control. This is In Control 5, and they're all like images cross-stitched of birth control methods, which obviously is, I mean, there's a subject matter that I barely touched upon in this show, which of course is incredibly important. My artwork in this series, In Control, rejects the stereotypical domestic functionality of samplers. Next, please. This piece was also in the last reiteration of the show by Christy Rush, Estrogen and Testosterone Molecules. How closely estrogen resembles testosterone, especially for one tiny hydrogen atom, which accordingly determines destiny. On the right, Melora painted this picture for the show. It's called Ruth with Marty, Role Reversal. Of course, it's of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But overlapping her face is a outline of her husband, Marty, who was famously a great supporter of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and in a role reversal, so to speak, allowed her and encouraged her to become the important person in our society that she did become. Next, please. And here again, we come back to the exhibition hall. And the name of the show actually came from Lola Jiblazee, who made these flags, Hermerica. She kindly allowed Portia and I to use the name. And these flags are feminist flags, no doubt, where the stripes are outlined pictures of female torsos or breasts instead of just stripes. And in the center are the small banners that are Votes for Women by Jenny Feder, my sister, of suffrage personalities throughout sort of 100 years of the beginning of the movement, portraits of the women that were involved. And as a tip to the hat to my sister, sisterhood is powerful. And next, the final slide. Vote was a piece by Laurie Steelink. This is actually an enlargement of postcards that Laurie created sort of as an action campaign, a Get Out the Vote postcard campaign. She lives out west. And her artwork relates to her Native American heritage, with as you can see, that the vote is made out of feathers. But as I said, it was an action to get out the vote, appropriate for this exhibition, I felt. And underneath it, the quote that is there, which I will read to you since it's so small, is from Abigail Scott Duniway, who lived from 1834 to 1915, who was a woman rights activist and a newspaper editor and writer. She said, the young woman of today, free to study, to speak, to write, to choose their occupation, should remember that every inch of this freedom was bought for them at a great price. It is for them to show their gratitude by helping onward the reforms of their own times, by spreading the light of freedom and of truth still wider. The debt that each generation owes to the past, it must pay to the future. And that's how I end the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was really great.
Thank you.
I'm going to see if there's any questions now. We don't, I know it's already 7, but I don't want to, if anyone does have a question, I don't want to, deny them the chance. Let me just look here and just see. There's a question if there's a plan for the show to travel. Do you have any plans?
I don't have any plans yet, but I am thinking about perhaps putting it into a catalog or book form and moving forward with it in that way. I mean, as I said, there's so many aspects of it that aren't even brought into this. I mean, the subject is fascinating and large. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I hope you can. I mean, I think this deserves to be everywhere in every state. There's a good question here. How did you balance the tension between victimization and empowerment in the women's movement?
Well, I think that's, that is an essential question. And I think that it's difficult. And I think that's why there are pieces of the contemporary work as well as the historical ephemera, which is brutal and tragic and sad. But then there are pieces that are celebrating the fight towards freedom in every different way. So I think that that's the push and pull of the story, and which I hope to do with having the variety of pieces and ephemera that's in the show.
Okay, that's a good answer. Well, I know we really are out of time, so I'm sorry I don't have time for any more questions, but I would just like to thank everyone who joined today. And thank you so much, Carrie, for curating such a wonderful and informative exhibition. The talk was recorded and it will be available to view on the Byrdcliffe YouTube channel in the next few days. So check back by like Saturday. And you're welcome, at that point to share it and watch it again if you missed anything. And if you have enjoyed our exhibitions and virtual programming, please consider making a donation to Woodstock Byrdcliffe Guild. Visit us on Instagram, Facebook, and at woodstockguild.org for the latest information about upcoming exhibitions and events. Our website also features items from the Byrdcliffe shop and information about becoming a member. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Karlyn. And everybody and all the artists that were in the show were fantastic.
Oh, right. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything else to say, Carrie, but yeah, thanks for mentioning the artists.
The artists were a great group. Thank you so much.
Were.
Carrie. Thank you, Carrie. Great talk.
Thank you.
And the show's up for 2 more weekends. So please tell everyone and go see it again.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
All right. Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.